They thought they owned me. That's the first thing I want you to understand, not in some motivational poster way, but in that specific suburban HOA way where a stranger can look you in the eye and act like your land is a community suggestion, not a legal boundary. And the wild part is I didn't wake up that morning planning a war. I woke up to construction noise so loud it rattled the window frames. And for one stupid second I thought, wow, the afterlife is really aggressive with renovation plans. My name is Hugo Alvarez, and last summer, late June, 7:30 a.m., the sound of heavy machinery dragged me out of sleep like a hook in my ribs, the kind of sound you don't hear unless someone is tearing into the earth. And that hit different for me because I'd moved into my parents' house only 3 months earlier, after they passed away within weeks of each other. The kind of double loss that doesn't just make you sad. It rewrites your whole nervous system. It turns quiet rooms into echoes. It makes every drawer you open feel like you're trespassing in your own history. That house on 168, Briarstone Drive had been in our family for more than 40 years, sitting right at the edge of what eventually grew into Cedar Haven Estates. The kind of development that looks peaceful on the outside, trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, neighborhood Facebook group that acts like it's the Supreme Court, and of course the HOA, Cedar Haven Community Association, which is basically a small government with a bigger ego. I walked outside in the first light of morning, barefoot, coffee in hand, and I stopped so hard I almost spilled it, because 30 feet inside my property line, right where my mom's rose garden used to be, there were workers in matching green polos unloading solar panel frames, drilling posts, laying conduit, like they'd done this 1,000 times and were annoyed the ground wasn't cooperating. I confronted them. The supervisor didn't even flinch. He told me they had permits from Cedar Haven Community Association for a green energy initiative, and he held up documents with neighborhood letterhead, stamped and signed, claiming the area was designated common community property, which would have been hilarious if it wasn't literally happening on top of my mother's roses. Before I could get my words lined up into something calm and lethal, Veronica Hale arrived, HOA president, stepping out of her sleek SUV like she owned the street. She had that practiced confidence people get when they've never had consequences, and she greeted me with a smile that never made it to her eyes. "Oh good, you've seen our new renewable project," she said, like I should clap. "Exciting, right?" I told her it was my land, and her expression cooled, not surprised, not embarrassed, just mildly irritated that I wasn't playing my assigned role. "Our records show this has always been community space," she said. And then she did the thing that made my stomach drop. She used my father's name, Antonio Alvarez, like it was a lever. Antonio was reasonable once he understood the bigger picture. That's when Grant Mercer joined her, HOA treasurer, retired corporate attorney, the kind of man who speaks in soft threats and thinks that makes him classy. And he warned me about penalties if I interfered, the word penalties rolling off his tongue like he was enjoying the flavor. Around us, neighbors watched from their porches and lawns, pretending to water plants that didn't need water, eyes flicking away as soon as mine found them, silence as a survival tactic. And the only person who gave me anything close to solidarity was Mateo Rivas, the landscaper, who gave me a tiny nod while discreetly taking photos. I went back inside, into my father's office, because I could feel myself heating up, and I knew anger without structure is how people like Veronica Hale win. So I opened my dad's records, surveys, deeds, plats, all the stuff he kept like scripture, and there it was. The boundary markers on the HOA's paperwork didn't match the real ones. The physical stakes had been moved, cleanly, deliberately, like someone thought my grief made me blind. My father used to tell me, when I was a kid and he'd catch someone cutting across our yard, "It's not about dirt, Hugo. It's about respect. If they take a little without asking, they'll keep taking until there's nothing left." And staring at those documents, I felt something inside me lock into place. This wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about my parents, their legacy, the last thing they left me that still felt solid. And I whispered into the quiet room, "I won't let them take this." And if you've ever lost someone you love, you know how crazy it sounds. But it felt like my dad was right there, like he'd leaned in close and said, "Good, now prove it." Monday morning, I walked into the Redwood County Records office with my father's worn leather portfolio under my arm, and the clerk, Donna Whitfield, looked up and recognized me immediately, which hit me harder than it should have. because grief has this nasty habit of ambushing you in fluorescent lighting. "You're Antonio's boy," she said softly. "I'm sorry. Your dad was one of the good ones. He used to bring me coffee when he came in here." We compared records for an hour, and the truth was clean and brutal. The official county boundaries matched my parents' documents exactly, not the HOA's fantasy map. And then Donna Whitfield lowered her voice and slid a folder closer like she was handing me a loaded weapon. "You're not the first," she said. "They've been doing this for years, expanding little by little, and people don't fight because the fights are expensive." When I asked why the county hadn't shut it down, she gave me the look people give when they're about to explain the world to you. "Veronica Hale's husband used to sit on the zoning board," she said. "Her sister-in-law still does. Connections are the only real property line around here." On the way home, I literally bumped into Avery Quinn, a new neighbor juggling environmental law textbooks. And when I mentioned my situation, her eyes sharpened instantly. Not gossip sharp, case-building sharp. "The Cedar Haven Community Association keeps wrapping shady projects in green language," she told me. "Permits rushed, inspections rubber-stamped, grant money that moves too easily. I've been collecting evidence. Let me look at what you have." That evening I went to the monthly HOA meeting, and the community room went quiet when I walked in. Not respectful quiet, fearful quiet, like my presence was contagious. And Veronica Hale arrived at exactly 7 o'clock wearing a green blazer like it was a badge, running the meeting with that exhausting tactic where they spend 40 minutes on minor nonsense so nobody has energy left for the real issues. When she asked if there were final concerns in a tone that screamed "We're done here," I stood up and said, calmly, "I want to address the solar installation currently happening on my property without consent." A murmur ran through the room, then silence. And I presented surveys, county records, photos of moved boundary markers, and I demanded construction stop immediately. Grant Mercer responded by saying property lines and planned communities have flexibility, which is lawyer speak for "I hope nobody here knows the law." Then he produced a document claiming my parents had agreed years ago to community use of that portion of land. I looked at it and knew instantly it was forged. My father's signature was close enough to insult him, but wrong enough to prove intent. And the date was during a time my parents were traveling, which meant whoever wrote it didn't even bother to check. They just assumed my grief was a blank check. "That document is forged," I said, louder now, because sometimes you have to let the room hear the truth, not just your enemy. Veronica Hale promised to review privately, then pivoted into a vote to continue the project anyway, board members raising hands like synchronized swimmers, a few residents following along who clearly benefited from her favor, and only Avery Quinn and I voted against. After the meeting, an older couple approached, Harold and Nora Baines, and Harold whispered that the HOA had done something similar to them with a drainage ditch, legal fees nearly bankrupting them. And Nora looked like she carried stress in her bones, her voice shaking when she said, "Don't give up, but be careful." The next morning I got an invoice for $8,200, my share of the installation, like I'd ordered an invasion of my own yard. And Avery Quinn called to tell me the HOA had filed for adverse possession, trying to claim they'd been using my land long enough to own it. Because if you repeat a lie long enough and bully people hard enough, sometimes the world just gives up. Then I got a message from Kara Lynn, a resident who said she'd been secretly recording meetings for over a year. Indeed, she asked me to meet at the library, and when she handed me a USB drive, her hands were trembling. "My husband used to sit on the board," she whispered. "He died suddenly after he started questioning financial reports." That sentence didn't just scare me, it rearranged me, because now this wasn't only theft, it was a pattern, a machine that crushed anyone who asked too many questions. Then a call came from Megan Hart at the assessor's office, and she delivered the line that made everything click into place. "The HOA hasn't just been stealing land," she said. "They've been routing the entire neighborhood's power through your property for years. And the main junction box, it's on your land." I'm an electrical engineer. Power grid systems are literally my language, and I knew what that meant. I grabbed my field equipment, GPS unit, multimeter, insulated gloves, camera, and I went hunting. 200 yards into the tree line, hidden like something shameful, I found it, an industrial-grade junction box, not residential, built to handle real throughput, with a small antenna tucked in like a secret, transmitting data off-site. And as I documented it, A twig snapped behind me. I turned, and there was Grant Mercer, standing in loafers that had no business in the woods, trying to sound amused, but his eyes were tight. He warned me I was out of my depth. He told me Veronica Hale had powerful friends, and then he smiled and said, "Your security cameras have been on a loop since yesterday. You might want to check your network." They hadn't just trespassed. They'd hacked my home. That night, I locked down my network, and I dug through public databases, utility commission registries, business filings, and I found the corporate skeleton under the green paint. The local utility entity Cedar Haven Grid Works, chaired by Veronica Hale, and the installer company Suncraft Renewables LLC, where she held silent ownership. A closed loop, her company installs, her grid profits, her HOA bullies, and the community pays more than they should while applauding sustainability. Then a journalist, Brooke Maddox, met me downtown, showed me grant documents, tax incentive trails, and then slid one article across the table like a match over gasoline. The parent company Northspan Energy Group was divesting, selling off this regional grid segment. The grid was up for auction, and I felt a plan form in my chest, quiet at first, then sharp and bright. Sometimes you don't win by arguing with the people holding power. Sometimes you buy the power out from under them. I formed a shell company called Alvarez Energy Holdings, with help from a lawyer friend who understood discretion and survival, and I submitted a bid to purchase Cedar Haven Grid Works, and Northspan Energy Group barely questioned it, because to them it was just a low-margin asset. They didn't understand the strategic value of a grid segment whose critical junction sat on land the HOA had been illegally occupying. While the paperwork processed, I listened to Carol Lynn's recordings, and I heard Veronica Hale say, in her own voice, that my father had become a problem, that they needed to accelerate the timeline for acquiring the property, and the line that made my blood go cold. One way or another, we need that land, whatever it takes. Then, another recording made shortly after my parents' funeral, she said, "This is our opportunity, he'll sell." They mistook grief for weakness. They didn't know grief can be a furnace. 45 days later, the ownership documents arrived, legal control transferred, and I stared at the papers in my hands thinking about my mother's roses, thinking about my father's surveys, thinking about the neighbors who looked away because they were afraid. Then I scheduled a routine maintenance assessment, and at exactly 9 a.m. on Monday, power went out at the HOA office and the homes of every board member, including Veronica Hale and Grant Mercer, while the rest of the neighborhood stayed perfectly lit. When their office called customer service, the phone rang directly to my pocket. "Cedar Haven Grid Works, customer support." I answered, calm, professional, with just enough sweetness to be terrifying. The assistant complained about the outage disrupting important community business, and I said we were conducting an infrastructure assessment. Service would be restored by 5 p.m., and then I added the real knife. Our records indicate unauthorized equipment connected to the main junction on private property at 168 Briarstone Drive. Remove all unauthorized connections within 72 hours or service may be discontinued permanently. That afternoon, notices appeared on every door announcing new ownership and an emergency community meeting, language reviewed by Avery Quinn, so it was airtight and ominous. And when the room filled that night with worried residents, I stood in the back feeling my heart slam against my ribs, because winning doesn't feel like movies. It feels like nausea and courage holding hands. Veronica Hale arrived late, disheveled, furious, trying to take control, saying the HOA was handling a misunderstanding with the utility, scanning for the new representative. "Actually," I said, stepping forward, "the representative is already here." I walked down the aisle, took the podium, introduced myself as the new owner and CEO of Cedar Haven Grid Works, and I watched the room change, shock spreading like electricity, faces turning toward the board like they'd just realized they'd been paying for their own leash. I presented everything: maps, photos, the junction box location, the forged signatures, the hidden antenna, the grant money trail, the inflated power rates, and then I played a short clip of Veronica Hale saying they needed my land, whatever it takes. People gasped. Someone shouted about being overcharged. Avery Quinn stood up and explained that real environmental initiatives don't require forgery and trespass, and Councilman Jordan Price promised a formal inquiry into the HOA's activities. Veronica tried her final move, painting me as vindictive, calling me selfish, accusing me of sabotaging community progress. And for a second the room wavered. Then Nora Baines stood, shaky but fierce, and said, "This isn't a community, it's your business." And that sentence cracked the spell. The county inspector declared the solar installation illegal, ordered removal. Prosecutors opened investigations into fraud and misappropriated grants, and the HOA office suddenly became a late-night light show, shredders humming, cars coming and going like rats from a sinking ship. And then, the desperate act, the night of the storm. My monitoring system alerted me to activity at the junction box, and the feed showed two figures in dark clothing carrying heavy bags, moving with purpose through the woods. Veronica Hale and Grant Mercer. They weren't there to comply, they were there to sabotage, and when I saw the insulated cutters, the kind used for high voltage, I knew this could kill them, or burn half the neighborhood if they triggered a surge and fire in the dry brush. I called Ray Delgado, the retired electrician, and then 911, and I drove like my heart was trying to outrun me, rain starting to fall, lightning flickering in the distance. I reached the clearing and shouted, flashlight blasting their faces, "Step away, that line is live, police are on the way." Grant panicked, but Veronica kept working, rage dripping out of her, snarling that I'd ruined years of planning, her political ambitions, her vision. And then, as more neighbors arrived with phones recording, drawn by the commotion and the sirens, the moment became undeniable. Witnesses everywhere. And in the chaos, Veronica slipped, cutters touched an exposed secondary line, a flash, a crackle, and she collapsed, alive but unconscious, while Ray Delgado shouted for nobody to touch her and used insulated tools to pull her clear. When police arrived, they didn't find a mysterious storm accident. They found attempted sabotage of critical infrastructure, caught on camera, witnessed by a crowd. Grant Mercer cooperated fast, because cowards always do when the lights turn on. The investigation uncovered the final horror beneath the solar array, an illegal tap into a natural gas pipeline junction under my property, disguised, nearly operational, the kind of thing that could have caused an environmental disaster, explosion risk, groundwater contamination, the exact opposite of the green future they sold on flyers. The HOA board was removed, charges filed, boundaries resurveyed and restored, and Veronica Hale faced fraud, forgery, trespass, attempted vandalism, and more, her image collapsing the way fake things always do when reality shows up with evidence. A year later, we transitioned Cedar Haven Gridworks into a neighborhood cooperative, transparent governance, fair rates, legitimate solar installed on actual common ground. Scholarships funded from settlements for local students in renewable energy, and on a warm summer evening, we held a small celebration on my land, under solar lights that were finally legal, finally honest. I replanted my mother's roses where they belonged, and standing there I felt closure, not because grief disappears, but because the line held, because my parents' legacy didn't get erased by paperwork and arrogance. And now the question I'll leave you with, because it's the one that still follows me when the house gets quiet. If you gain power over the people who abused it, if you can flip the switch they used to threaten you, is it still justice if it tastes a little like revenge? Do the methods matter if the outcome protects the community? And honestly, if you were me, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have stopped sooner or gone further?